Hi everyone, and welcome to our opening video lecture for the Doctoral Writing and Research Seminar. For most of you, this is the opening class to your doctoral studies, so perhaps the best place to start is by considering the nature of a PhD. Finishing a PhD is like getting a union card or guild membership. It shows that you can contribute original research. Now, not all PhDs go on to publish. That's not necessarily a defining feature. However, by virtue of completing a dissertation, it is expected that your work has the caliber of being published in a peer-reviewed press. Later on, we'll review the basic conventions and general strategies of scholarly writing, but the primary point here is that a successful PhD demonstrates the ability to effectively communicate our research findings. Stated simply, a successful PhD is a piece of original work which makes a significant contribution to knowledge. Now, a lot of PhD students worry whether their research is good enough to be a significant contribution. I mean, what exactly qualifies as a significant contribution? So when I was a PhD student not too long ago, my peers and I came across this illustration of what it means to contribute to knowledge. Now, I recommend you pause the video here to take a closer look at the frames, but the key idea here is to put your expected contribution into context. You know, you're not expected to make this massive, monumental breakthrough with your dissertation. So don't put unfair or unreasonable expectations on yourself. This is about making small, incremental gains at the margins. This is a manageable goal. Don't lose sight of that. So this is where you want to go. You want to finish a PhD. But where do you start? I know it seems kind of daunting, but luckily you have a couple of years to figure this out. Still, there's no time like the present to get started. And perhaps the best place to start is by considering what led you here, your personal motivations. Now, you can use these questions as prompts for your autobiographical essay due at the end of the week. I'll talk more about that later. For now, the goal is to focus on identifying and cultivating your interest in Holocaust and genocide studies. So what do you want to learn more about? Like I said, you have a couple of years of coursework to figure this out, but you can use your interest as a starting point to settle on a topic, which in turn should ultimately lead to a research question or set of questions, the latter of which will be the centerpiece of what will eventually become your dissertation proposal, which is your first big milestone in the quest to finishing a PhD. Now, this may be an overly simplified formula for where you need to go from here, but let's work backwards, starting with the desired outcome. As I said, you'll eventually need a good research question or set of questions for your dissertation proposal a couple of years from now. Now, we'll talk a lot more about what makes a good research question in a few weeks, but how do you even get to that point? Well, topics are means to an end. Topics are particular aspects of general subjects or disciplines. For example, the discipline or subject matter of Holocaust and genocide studies is made up of countless possible topics, all with their own respective bodies of literature. Now, having a topic isn't enough to make a dissertation proposal. You need a good research question for that. But it is crucial to first have a good topic in order to eventually write a proposal. Now, you'll be exposed to all sorts of topics during your coursework, but in order to turn a topic into a question, you have to have enough interest to provide the necessary motivational foundation for your project. I mean, you have to find something that you're genuinely interested in. You need a certain degree of curiosity to drive you forward, as well as a certain degree of passion. I'll come back to this at the end of the video lecture when I discuss this week's assignment. Before I get to the general content in this week's video lecture, I have a few words to say about reading 1 this week. So I used to assign this entire book, but I've decided to just require certain portions for both this week and next. Now, this book is a classic, used in many graduate level research seminars, so I highly encourage you to get a copy of the entire book for yourself. Now, these page numbers correspond with the 4th and most recent edition of the book, but honestly, whatever edition you can get doesn't really matter all that much. I mean, try to at least get the 3rd, if not the 4th edition, but as far as the big picture is concerned, any version will do just fine. Now, as for the 75 pages or so that are required this week, when the syllabus says required reading, please understand that I don't expect you to fully digest all 75 pages. Next week, I'll introduce the digestion metaphor as a strategy for quickly reading large amounts of material. Basically, as you develop the skill of skimming, you need to develop your own discretion as a reader about what to save for later and what to devour right now. So if we look at the table of contents for part 2, I recommend focusing more immediately on chapters 3 and 4, saving 5 and 6 for later. Chapters 3 and 4 will help you get started on the final assignment. I'll talk more about this later, but the second half of our course is going to be dedicated to workshopping research proposals. This reading in particular will help you get started. Okay, with that said, I want to review some general content, starting with grammar and sentence construction. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time talking about grammar. For one thing, I'm admittedly not the best at this myself, but here are a couple of common errors. So, for example, I have a problem with sentence fragments and run-ons. It's because I often start my writing process by jotting down keywords and phrases as I read. But when I'm taking notes, I don't always think in terms of grammatically correct sentences. You know what I mean? So I have to stitch together these fragments into sentences, and sometimes it takes me a few rounds of drafting to get it right. Another issue I commonly have is subject-verb agreement. The rule is pretty simple. A single subject takes a singular verb, whereas a plural subject takes a plural verb. And keep in mind that the lack of tense consistency is a common mistake, not just in sentences, but across paragraphs and pages as well. Now, I'm not going to go through the rest of these, but for a helpful resource, check out this website from Purdue, as well as this classic book, The Elements of Style, which is available on Canvas. The latter will help in sentence construction, which, again, I'm not going to discuss much, apart from these two things. First, always try to write in the active voice, following this basic construction: subject, verb, and object. The active voice is usually more direct and vigorous than the passive, which tends to be less direct, less bold, and less concise. With that said, there are times when the passive voice is convenient or necessary. Second, it's crucial to write in clear sentences with concise, specific language, free of redundancies. Parsimony is a key virtue of writing well. Now let's move on to the elementary principles of paragraph construction. Paragraphs are the building blocks of scholarly writing. As the basic unit of composition, make sure that each single paragraph is defined by a single coherent topic. A rudimentary strategy is to begin each paragraph with a topic sentence in order to aid and provide a signpost for the reader, who should never be lost at sea searching for the topic. Of course, you don't always have to start each paragraph as such, but really the key lesson here is that the topic of the paragraph should be clear, unambiguous, and fully evident. Reading 2 suggests a more advanced strategy called the uneven U, which you see depicted here. This provides a 5-level system of sentence structure within a single paragraph, with each sentence level based on relative degrees of abstraction and specificity. The higher up the scale, the more abstract, the lower, more concrete. Look at the graph and key on the right. See how the paragraph opens with general statements, moves down to provide evidence for its claim, and then summarizes and extends that evidence before moving on to an abstract conclusion. This is an ideal paragraph structure. Notice as well how the paragraph ends on a higher level from where it started. This gives the paragraph a progressive structure, moving the conversation forward. And as we'll see in the next slide, by combining this type of paragraph into larger structures of multiple paragraphs, you can establish a developmental rhythm and trajectory that communicates the overall goals of your work. For example, look at this graph here, which is also from reading 2. This shows a series of uneven U-shaped paragraphs that are structured together into a fractal formation. To reiterate my point from the previous slide, look at the progressive trajectory of this structure. This graph depicts a narrative flow or movement, which is a key stylistic device. Remember, scholarly writing is inherently communicative. This point is typically underappreciated in academia. I mean, how many of you have read an academic article or book that you had to trudge through? Frankly, a lot of academic writing is bad writing. But moving on with the assigned readings, the authors of Reading 3 remind us of helpful literary strategies to improve our communicative performance. For example, pacing is a stylistic device that shows how a story unfolds. Basic principle of this application in academic writing is to reveal or disclose the discursive process to the reader. That is, to provide a plot-like argumentative line for the reader to follow. Practically, this plot-like argumentative line requires a balance between action and commentary, between evidence and analysis. Or to use the 5-point scale from the previous slide, level 4 or 5 elements with level 1 or 2 elements. You want a narrative that's neither too thin, in terms of skimping on analysis, nor too thick, in terms of analysis that's too dense, difficult to penetrate. On a more general level, Reading 3 stresses the need to incorporate a human element into academic writing, which otherwise tends to be too dry and unrelatable. Now, I'm not suggesting that you should be exclusively writing a first-person narrative. Moreover, I'm using the word storytelling metaphorically, not literally. There's a serious risk of oversimplifying things by making it too personal, so that's not exactly what I'm suggesting. Rather, what I'm saying is that, as an author, your readers need to hear your authorial voice, and that sometimes, not always, but sometimes, a subtle personal touch makes your writing more accessible, thereby enhancing its communicability. Practically, this doesn't necessarily entail first-person narration. I'll come back to the risk of speaking in the first person momentarily, but there are other ways to accomplish this recommendation, such as using anecdotes or illustrative examples. The key idea of academic storytelling is that you want to relate to your reader, to keep them engaged and following along with your argument. Now, we're getting ahead of ourselves a bit, as we'll discuss the nature of scholarly arguments next week. For now, let's take a step back and talk about how to even start the writing process. What strategies are there for getting writing done? The biggest tip is consistency. Get in the habit of writing daily. Carve out a specific block of time every workday and just write. Give yourself small, easily achievable goals. Don't plan to write 4 pages a day. Don't try to write 8 hours a day or whatever. Focus on the slow and steady. Write about anything related to your scholarship. Write about what you're reading in class, for example. In fact, you may want to maintain a research journal for yourself. Not only does it help your habit of writing daily, but you can keep track of what you're doing on a day-to-day basis. And who knows, you may end up generating some rough content for your future dissertation. Simply practice what we call free writing, or writing without constraint, without feeling self-conscious. Don't worry about correct grammar or spelling. Just keep writing. No matter how crazy or unorganized it is, free writing is just for you. This isn't the polished material that you share with others. Rather, this is the raw content that gets your thoughts down on paper. While free writing, don't worry about finding the right words. Follow your so-called felt sense. This is the process for finding words for what we sense but cannot yet express. If you feel like you're struggling to articulate a point, simply accept the words that just arrive in the mind. Be comfortable about noticing if they're wrong or don't fit what we feel or intend. Often we don't find the quote-unquote right words the first go-round. So avoid trying to decide on the right word, at least while free writing. It's much better to instead write down a few quote-unquote wrong words and see where they lead. Only later, while revising, do you need to balance this prerogative with the virtue of parsimony, of being concise with your language. With that said, avoid premature revising, especially during your daily free writing routine. Carve out another slot of time to go back and rework what you've already written. It's always good to have a little break in between. Remember that every piece of scholarly writing results from a good deal of hard work that never makes it onto the page. That's what is meant by the iceberg metaphor. Your final product is what the reader sees above the surface, but that final presentation would not be possible without the discursive structure hidden below. So, in sum, as you develop your writing habits, you need to find your scholarly voice. There's a fine balance here between establishing a formal tone that resonates with your professional audience without getting too dull. When you're done free writing and you're revising your final drafts, avoid informalities. Readers want to hear your voice, but this isn't the same as a normal in-person conversation. Unlike in-person conversations, your final writing products take time and careful consideration to produce. There are formal expectations to follow. Stylistically, you want to be clear in moving your plot-like argument along, but don't become too repetitive in announcing what will be done or what has just been done. Keep the pace moving forward, while also providing just enough signposting along the way. And more importantly, add your own thoughts, ideas, interpretations, and analysis to the conversation. What's your position on whatever it is that you're writing about? That is the key to developing your scholarly voice. With that said, use first-person pronouns cautiously. Certainly, they can help you while free writing, but try taking them out when revising. If your phrase or sentence doesn't lose any meaning without them, then obviously you don't need them. Only use them when appropriate, such as when you're trying to achieve a certain degree of assertiveness or clarity, or when you're positioning yourself in your writing. The rule of thumb here is to just be very cautious. To that end, let me talk about your assignment this week. You are to write a short post on the Canvas discussion forum. Please note that I'm not really concerned with an upper word limit. Write as much as you like, but remember, parsimony is a virtue. As for a prompt, I want you to respond to these 3 sets of questions. First, introduce yourself. Who are you? Where are you from? What's your background? What led you to Graz? Next, identify your motivations. Why do you want to earn a PhD? What are your career plans? And how will a PhD contribute to your professional development? Finally, reflect on your standpoint. What normative beliefs and/or personal values inform your position on things? How does your identity inform your perspective? And most crucially, what biases, predispositions, and/or assumptions are you bringing to the table? Now, this last set of questions is an exercise in standpoint theory, which I'll discuss further in my Week 4 video lecture on historiography and epistemology, where I make the relevant point that all knowledge is socially situated. More on that later. But the basic idea of standpoint theory is aptly captured by this famous Indian parable about the blind men and the elephant. Perhaps you're already familiar with it. If not, go do a quick internet search. The moral of the story, as far as standpoint theory is concerned, is that subjectivity limits our perspective of reality. Now, for all practical purposes, I want you to consider your own standpoint in relation to our field of study. Where are you positioned as part of the larger power dynamics at stake here? Okay, and that's it for this week's video lecture. The only assignment you have this week is the autobiographical essay. Looking ahead to next week, you're going to need to select one of the dissertations that I provided for the source analysis assignments, which will be due weeks 2, 3, and 4. I'll talk more about that next week. Additionally, you should get started thinking about a research proposal for the second half of the course. Again, more on that later. Otherwise, I'll leave it here. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.